Hey, put that down, I yelled, my voice slicing through the cold Virginia air. The sound startled even me. It was raw, cracked, desperate. Greg Thornton, the HOA president, froze mid-lift, one gloved hand gripping my firewood. He turned slowly, lips curling into a smirk, like I was the one who'd just been caught doing something wrong. His breath fogged in the dawn light, and for a moment, the only sound was the crunch of frost under my boots as I stepped closer. I'm Emily Carter, and until that morning, I thought I understood how far an HOA could push. I'd been living in this small, pine-framed house for 7 years, ever since my husband Mark passed away. The place wasn't perfect, but it was ours. He built that shed out back himself. Every beam sanded smooth, every nail placed by hand. The firewood stacked beside it was his system too, 3 cords deep, dried, and covered. Enough to heat the house through even the worst Appalachian winter. That pile meant warmth, stability, and survival. Lately, though, something had been wrong. Every few days, I'd noticed the stack thinning. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I'd miscounted. But when half the pile disappeared overnight, I knew someone was taking it. Out here, firewood isn't cheap. It's work, sweat, and hours of hauling. I started waking up early, keeping the curtains cracked, waiting for movement. And that morning, the waiting paid off. I saw headlights cutting across the backyard from the old service road. My heart kicked into gear. I grabbed my coat, shoved on my boots, and slipped outside. There he was, Greg Thornton, the man who ran our HOA like it was his private kingdom. Clipboard always tucked under one arm, rules in his pocket, fines in his hand. He was wearing that same beige jacket with the embroidered HOA logo, crouched by my shed, lifting my firewood into the back of his truck. When I shouted, he didn't look scared. He looked annoyed. "Morning, Emily," he said smoothly, brushing snow from his gloves. "This wood belongs to the community. We're hosting a winter safety demo at the clubhouse." I stared at him, stunned. The community? Greg, that's my firewood. My husband cut that wood. He shrugged, the smirk never leaving his face. Then I'm sure he'd be happy it's going to good use. He turned, tossed another log onto the pile, and slammed the tailgate shut. The sound echoed through the trees like a door slamming on my patience. I wanted to scream, to grab my phone and call the sheriff right then. But something in his expression stopped me. That smug, satisfied smirk. I realized if I lost my temper, I'd lose control of the story. That's what he wanted. So I bit my tongue until I tasted iron, watching as he drove off, leaving tire tracks in the frost and rage boiling in my chest. When I walked back inside, I stood by the window for a long time, staring at the empty space where my woodpile had been. My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from humiliation. I'd let him steal from me in plain sight. The sound of his truck still echoed in my ears, and I made myself a promise then and there. I'd never let him touch a single piece of mine again. That night, I drove into town, bought 2 trail cameras, and mounted them behind the shed. One on the tree line, one near the gate. I wasn't going to yell next time. I was going to watch, record, wait, because if Greg Thornton wanted to play dirty, I'd show him just how clean revenge could look. Failure to comply will result in legal action. The letter read, bold font, official HOA letterhead, signed by Greg Thornton himself. My jaw tightened as I read the next line. He'd fined me for missing firewood. The absurdity of it made me laugh out loud at first, until I realized this wasn't a joke. The letter claimed I had violated Section 4B, improper yard storage, citing unauthorized removal of natural materials. Translation: Greg had stolen my firewood, then fined me because it was gone. I stood there in my kitchen, the smell of coffee burning on the stove, staring at the paper until the words blurred. It wasn't just about wood anymore. It was about power. I walked outside, scanning the street. Greg's white SUV crawled down the block, slow as a predator, clipboard balanced on his steering wheel. Every few houses, he'd stop, jot something down, then glance up at my porch. He didn't wave this time. He didn't need to. That smug grin from the other morning had already done the talking. The next day, another letter appeared in my mailbox. Fine. $150. Violation. Unkempt yard. My yard was spotless. Then came another. Unauthorized shed color. Followed by visible clutter near property boundary. Each one more ridiculous than the last. I stacked them neatly on my kitchen counter, watching the pile grow like a stack of threats. Neighbors started whispering. At the grocery store, at the mailbox, in hushed tones over fences. You're not the first, one woman told me quietly. He fined us last year for inconsistent mailbox alignment. I paid just to avoid trouble. He threatened to tow my truck, another said. Didn't even give notice. Everyone had a story, but no one wanted to take him on. Greg had a reputation for making people miserable if they pushed back. But I wasn't like the others. I'd already been through worse than Greg Thornton. I'd buried a husband, rebuilt a home, and started from nothing. An HOA bully wasn't going to break me. I created a folder, labeled it HOA documentation. Every letter went inside. I photographed each violation notice, time-stamped the images, and stored digital copies on a flash drive. I took photos of my yard every morning and evening, front and back, proof of my compliance. If Greg wanted to play games, I'd make sure every move he made was recorded. Legally, I knew he was overstepping. I did. Some digging that night, reading through Virginia HOA statutes. Turns out, HOAs can impose fines without giving at least 14 days written notice and an opportunity for the homeowner to appeal. Greg hadn't done any of that. He was winging it, using HOA paper to feed his ego. But what stung most wasn't the money or the threats. It was the way he'd look at me when he drove by. Slow, smiling, like he owned me. Each letter felt personal, like he was daring me to react. Days passed, and the fines didn't stop. Then, one morning, a thicker envelope arrived, hand-delivered, stamped urgent. Inside was a typed notice. Mandatory property inspection scheduled. Thursday, 9 a.m. Failure to allow access may result in additional penalties. My stomach dropped. There was no request, no consent, no vote, just an order. I looked out my window, and there he was again, Greg Thornton, parked across the street, clipboard resting on his knee, watching my house like a hawk. That Thursday, he'd be walking into my yard. But this time, I wouldn't just be ready. I'd be recording every second. Open the gate, Ms. Carter. HOA business. Greg's voice cracked across my yard like a whip. I froze mid-step, a cup of coffee still in my hand, as his pounding echoed against the wooden fence. The tone wasn't a request. It was an order. When I didn't move, he shouted again, louder this time. You are required to grant access for inspection. The nerve in his voice made it sound official, like he had a badge or a warrant. But he didn't. He had a clipboard and a God complex. I didn't agree to any inspection, Greg. I called back, my voice firm but shaking. You don't have permission to enter my property. His answer came in the form of boots scraping against the fence. By the time I reached the back porch, he was already swinging a leg over, his khaki jacket snagging on a nail. Behind him stood a tall, nervous-looking man holding a camera and a cheap reflective vest that read, Inspector. You can't just, I started, but Greg cut me off. Ma'am, this is HOA authorized. Step aside. We'll make this quick. The audacity left me speechless. He strutted past me like a man inspecting his own land, that smug clipboard clutched to his chest. The so-called inspector trailed behind, snapping photos of everything. My porch, the shed, even the firewood stack that was now half empty. I could feel the heat rise up my neck. My hands trembled, not with fear but fury. I slipped my phone from my pocket, thumbed the camera, and hit record. If Greg wanted to invade my privacy, I'd make sure the invasion was documented. He circled the shed, muttering about non-standard construction and improper materials. Then he stopped in front of the firewood rack, smirking. Looks like someone's been careless with storage again, he said loudly, making sure I could hear every word. I clenched my jaw. That's because you stole half of it. I snapped before I could stop myself. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing. You really should watch those accusations, Miss Carter. Defamation can get messy. He tapped his pen on the clipboard twice, like a judge announcing a sentence, and scribbled something down. Then, as he made his way back toward the porch, he glanced at the old bench Mark had built years ago. The varnish had faded, the wood was cracked with time, but it was one of the last things he'd made before he died. Greg pointed at it with mock disgust. That thing looks like it's from a junkyard. Guess your husband wasn't much of a carpenter. The words hit harder than I expected. For a second, my chest locked, and I forgot how to breathe. I could feel tears threatening, but I swallowed them. He wanted a reaction. I gave him silence. Fine, he said, gesturing to his fake inspector. We'll note it down. Expect penalties. They left without another word, stepping over the fence the same way they'd come in. My hands were still shaking as I ended the recording on my phone. Virginia's one-party consent law meant I didn't need his permission to record him. For the first time, that HOA handbook was going to work in my favor. When the gate slammed shut, the silence in my yard felt deafening. The sun had dipped behind the trees, but I barely noticed. I sat on that old bench, the one Greg mocked, and stared at the shed. The smell of pine, the memory of Mark's hands sanding the boards smooth, filled my chest until it hurt. That night, I spread out a notepad on the kitchen table. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was calculating. If Greg wanted to keep taking from me, I'd give him something worth taking. Something that would come back to bite him. As the wind howled outside, I wrote 2 words across the top of the page. Termite plan. The moment I smelled those rotting logs in the woods, I knew exactly what Greg deserved. The air was thick with decay, damp earth, and something sharper, the scent of rot that sticks to the back of your throat. I pushed aside a fallen branch and saw them. A collapsed stack of firewood, half consumed by termites, their tunnels etched into the wood like veins. I crouched down, watching the pale insects scatter from the light, and a thought crossed my mind that made me pause. Those termites were more than a pest. They were poetic justice waiting to happen. It was late afternoon, the sun bleeding orange through the trees. I'd gone hiking just to clear my head, to escape Greg's voice echoing in my skull. His threats, his clipboard, his smirk. But when I saw those logs, it felt like the forest itself had handed me a weapon. I knew the rules. I'd read enough pest control manuals while maintaining my cabin to understand exactly what termites could do to untreated wood. Greg's perfect cedar deck? It would be paradise for them. I kicked at one of the logs and watched it crumble. The surface still looked solid, but beneath that thin shell the core was alive, buzzing, moving, eating. The more I looked, the clearer my plan became. That evening I returned with gloves, a tarp, and my pickup. The sound of each infested log hitting the truck bed was oddly satisfying. A thud of rebellion. I brought them home, careful not to drag them across the grass, and set up behind the shed. I brushed off the bark, trimmed the jagged ends, and rubbed a bit of clean sawdust across the surface. When I was done, they looked perfect, fresh, dry, just like the ones Greg liked to steal. As I worked, a small part of me hesitated. This wasn't the kind of revenge you could take back. But then I pictured Greg's smug grin as he told me my husband's work looked like junkyard scrap. That memory hardened my resolve. This wasn't about spite. It was about balance. By the time the sun went down, I had 3 neat rows stacked in plain view beside my shed, exactly where the last pile had been. I even tossed a few smaller pieces off to the side, just to make it look natural. If Greg's habits held true, he'd be back within days. Inside, I pulled up the live feed from my trail cameras, adjusting the angles until they caught every corner of the yard. The screens flickered, the infrared glow casting a faint red across my face. I could already imagine it. Greg creeping through the fence line, thinking he was outsmarting me. As I closed my laptop, I caught my reflection in the window. Half lit, tired, but steady. I didn't feel guilty. I felt focused, like I was finally taking my life back. one log at a time. I turned off the lights, leaving the firewood stacked perfectly under the moonlight. The air outside was still, thick with the scent of pine and damp soil. Somewhere in the woods, a night bird called, the sound low and haunting. I almost smiled. Then, just after midnight, I saw it. Headlights cutting slowly through the tree line, creeping toward my yard. The low hum of an engine, familiar and unwelcome. Greg Thornton was back. Gotcha, I whispered as Greg loaded my gift logs into his truck again, smiling like a thief in daylight. The camera feed glowed faintly from my laptop inside, capturing every movement in perfect clarity. Greg didn't even hesitate this time. He backed his truck right up to my fence line, headlights dimmed, tailgate open. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. He wasn't sneaking. He was claiming. Like my yard was his inventory. I watched him through the cracked blinds, heart pounding steady, not from fear this time, but anticipation. He glanced over his shoulder once, then bent down to lift another log, stacking it neatly on the pile. The man even wiped his hands after every few pieces, like he was proud of his hard work. My trail camera caught every second, the reflection of his watch, the creak of the tailgate, even the faint scrape of boots over gravel. This time, I didn't intervene. No yelling, no confrontation, just quiet observation and perfect patience. If the law had taught me anything these past weeks, it was that sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon. As Greg climbed into his truck and slammed the door, I whispered to the screen, "Take it all." He revved the engine once, twice, and pulled out toward the main road, the red taillights fading into the dark. When the truck disappeared, I finally exhaled. I replayed the footage twice, once for satisfaction, once for security. His face, his license plate, his hands lifting every log. It was all there. And the best part? The law was on my side. Legal nugget. When someone steals property, even without breaking a lock or fence, ownership and liability of that property transfer immediately to the thief. If anything happens as a result of what they took, it's their problem. Greg had just volunteered for his own downfall. For days I heard nothing. Just silence, like the calm before a thunderstorm. Then one afternoon, the neighborhood group chat lit up. My phone buzzed non-stop. "Anyone else dealing with termites?" One message read. "Greg's deck is rotting," another said. I scrolled through the thread, heartbeat quickening. Then I saw it. Greg's wife Linda had posted a series of photos. Splintered boards, hollow beams, and a caption written in all caps. "Sabotage. Someone intentionally damaged our property." The irony was too delicious to process. I stared at those pictures. His expensive cedar deck chewed to pulp, and had to stifle a laugh. The same man who'd mocked my husband's craftsmanship now had a deck that looked like wet paper. Neighbors chimed in with sympathy, others with suspicion. Greg blamed vandals, claimed it was an attack against HOA leadership. He even warned residents to secure their materials from malicious individuals. I stayed silent. Inside, the smell of pine still lingered from where I'd cut the disguise pieces for the logs. Every time I walked past the shed, I felt that same electric satisfaction, the kind that tingles at the back of your neck when justice starts tipping in your favor. I hadn't just given Greg wood. I'd given him the mirror image of his own greed. Still, a part of me stayed cautious. Revenge had a way of circling back, and Greg wasn't the kind of man who admitted defeat. That night, I reviewed the camera footage again, just to be sure. It was flawless. Unshakable evidence if I ever needed it. I backed it up to a flash drive and hid it in the kitchen drawer under the silverware tray. When I finally went to bed, I left the window cracked open. The night was cold and still, the kind that carries every sound through the air. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard a car door slam, but I told myself it was just the wind. Until the next morning, when the pounding started. It was hard, angry, rhythmic. The kind of knock that doesn't wait for permission. "Emily!" Greg's voice bellowed through the door. "Open up! Now!" "You did this!" Greg screamed, jabbing a finger at me in front of the whole HOA board. His voice bounced off the community hall walls, sharp and ugly. Every head in the room turned toward me, and suddenly I was the villain in his story. I hadn't planned to go to that meeting. I'd only heard about it because a neighbor texted that Greg had called an urgent session about acts of property vandalism. Still, curiosity and a touch of defiance brought me there. When I walked in, Greg was already pacing the front of the room, holding up photos of his collapsed deck like a prosecutor before a jury. "Look at this," he barked, slamming the pictures down on the table. "Termite damage, thousands in repairs. Someone planted infested logs behind my house, and I know exactly who did it." Then he turned toward me, eyes blazing. "Emily Carter. The same woman who's been at war with this HOA since winter began." Gasps rippled across the room. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at me like they were waiting for a confession. My throat tightened, but I stayed seated, hands clasped in my lap. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said evenly. Greg sneered. "Oh, don't play innocent. You were furious after those fines. You probably lured those termites onto my property out of spite." "I don't control insects, Greg," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "And if I did, they'd have better taste than your deck." A murmur of laughter slipped from someone in the back row, but Greg didn't find it funny. His face reddened. "Enough. I've already filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff. This is vandalism, and it's criminal." The words hit me like ice water. Around me, the board erupted into whispers, terms like lawsuit, liability, and police report floating through the noise. That's when I heard it, the low rumble of boots on the tile. 2 deputies stepped into the room, their presence quiet but heavy. The taller one scanned the space, eyes landing on me. "Miss Carter?" I nodded, pulse pounding in my ears. "I'm Deputy Harris. Mr. Thornton here filed a report claiming you intentionally damaged his property. We'd like to ask a few questions." Greg puffed up behind him, victorious. "See? I told you she'd act guilty." But I didn't give him the satisfaction. I stood slowly, smoothed my jacket, and met the deputy's gaze. "I'm happy to cooperate," I said, calm and clear. "But I'd like to see the evidence first." Greg interrupted again. "The evidence is my deck. Termites don't just appear overnight. She did something." The deputy turned toward him, expression unreadable. "Sir, we'll handle the questioning." Then, looking back at me, his voice softened. "You're not under arrest. We're just gathering information." I nodded again, breathing through the adrenaline. Inside, I was trembling, fear, anger, disbelief all tangling together. But outside, I was composed. I remembered something I'd read once in a homeowner's legal forum. To prove vandalism, police need evidence of intent. Without it, it's just accusation. Greg didn't have intent. He had bad luck and arrogance. The meeting dissolved soon after. Neighbors avoided my eyes as I walked out. Greg still shouting about justice behind me. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and grounding. I stood by my car for a long moment, replaying the confrontation, forcing my breathing to slow. Then headlights washed over me, one of the deputies pulling up beside my driveway. The window rolled down, and his voice cut through the engine noise. "Ms. Carter," he said quietly, "do you have any evidence that might help your case?" "Play the video," I said, my voice steady but cold. The sheriff leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and I hit the spacebar. The screen flickered once before the grainy footage came to life. Greg Thornton, in his HOA jacket, loading my firewood into the back of his truck under the faint beam of a flashlight. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the laptop. The date and time stamp glowed clearly in the corner. 3:14 a.m., 2 weeks earlier. The image was close enough to show the sweat on his neck, the plate number on his truck, and that self-satisfied smirk as he stacked my property in neat rows like it was his weekend chore. I'd replayed that video countless times alone in my kitchen, memorizing every detail. But watching it now, with the sheriff present, Greg sitting 3 feet away, and half the HOA board behind him, felt different. It wasn't just proof. It was power. Greg's face drained of color as his own reflection blinked back at him from the screen. This, this is doctored, he stammered. She's lying. Anyone can fake a video. The sheriff didn't flinch. License plate matches your truck, Mr. Thornton. Timestamp lines up with your HOA patrol schedule. Greg's mouth opened, then closed again. His jaw worked silently, his hands tightening around the armrest of the chair. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something new in his eyes. Not arrogance, not control, fear. When the video ended, I pulled up a second clip from the following week. Here's him taking the second load, I said quietly. The footage showed Greg again, same routine, same confidence. The sheriff leaned back, sighed, and turned toward me. Ms. Carter, he said, you're officially cleared of all suspicion. This wasn't vandalism. It was theft. You've been the victim, not the perpetrator. Those words, you're cleared, hit me harder than I expected. My shoulders sagged, the weeks of tension finally slipping off like a heavy coat. I nodded, barely able to get out a thank you. The sheriff packed up his notes, reminding Greg that theft is prosecutable even if the victim doesn't press charges. It was a simple statement, but it landed like a threat. Greg glared at me as the officers left, his jaw twitching. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The truth had spoken loud enough. As the door closed, the room remained heavy with silence. The HOA board members, once so loyal to Greg, avoided his gaze. One by one, they began gathering their papers, muttering about needing to review policies. The man who'd ruled this neighborhood like a dictator suddenly looked very small. When I finally stepped outside, the cool air filled my lungs like freedom. Neighbors peeked through blinds as I walked home, and for the first time in months, I didn't care. Let them look. Let them wonder. The story would spread soon enough. That night I poured myself a glass of wine and watched the footage. Again, not out of spite, but out of relief. Proof had power, and mine was undeniable. Greg's empire of fines and intimidation had started to crumble, one stolen log at a time. For the first time since Mark's death, I felt peace. Not complete, but real. The house was quiet, the air clean, the cameras still blinking their soft red lights outside my window. When the sun rose, I woke to a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. Silence. No clipboard tapping, no HOA truck idling. I made coffee, sat by the window, and let myself believe it was over. Then I opened my mailbox. Inside was a thick envelope with the HOA logo stamped in bold ink. My stomach sank as I unfolded the letter. Notice of foreclosure proceedings, unpaid fines and fees. Greg wasn't finished with me yet. Failure to pay will result in foreclosure. The notice read, stamped in red ink across the top like a death sentence. My breath caught. They were threatening to take my home, over fines I never owed. The letter was printed on official HOA letterhead, Greg's name scribbled at the bottom in his proud, looping signature. The amount? $3,142,089. The reason? Outstanding violations and administrative fees. My first reaction was disbelief, then laughter, a short, bitter sound that filled the kitchen. But it wasn't funny. Not when I realized how deliberate it was. Greg wasn't just angry anymore. He was trying to destroy me. I laid out every letter he'd ever sent. The fines for yard clutter, the citations for improper storage. I'd paid none of them because I hadn't done anything wrong. But Greg had found another route. By filing an HOA lien, he could claim my property as collateral for unpaid fines, even though the so-called debts were fabricated. That night, I barely slept. I could almost hear Greg's smug voice echoing in my head. The rules apply to everyone, Emily. The next morning, I made a decision. If he wanted to play legal games, I'd meet him on the same battlefield. I started with a call to the Virginia Attorney General's HOA office. The woman who answered sounded calm and practiced, like she'd handled hundreds of calls just like mine. When I explained the situation, she said, "You have every right to request the HOA's financial ledger, Ms. Carter. They're legally obligated to provide it upon written request. Every transaction, every expense. Her tone shifted slightly, more serious. If they refuse or delay, that's a red flag. Keep everything in writing. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of control. I typed the request myself, formal, detailed, citing the Virginia Property Owners Association Act. I hand-delivered the letter to the HOA office and made sure to get a time-stamped copy for my records. Greg's assistant, a timid woman named Rachel, accepted it with shaking hands. I could tell she knew something was wrong. 3 days later, I received an email with a link to the HOA's financial statements. The file was massive. Dozens of pages of transactions, receipts, and board-approved expenditures. I brewed a pot of coffee and began reading line by line. At first, it looked ordinary. Landscaping costs, maintenance fees, event budgets. Then I noticed patterns. Every large withdrawal, new community signage, deck maintenance, building repairs, was signed off by Greg Thornton. Not unusual for a president, but what was strange were the payments to unfamiliar contractors, most of whom shared Greg's mailing address or personal P.O. box. Then came the smoking gun, an invoice marked Emergency Deck Repair, HOA funds, dated 2 weeks after his termite disaster. The payment? $7,150. The signature of approval? Greg's own. My pulse quickened. I cross-referenced the dates with his bank reimbursements. He'd funneled HOA money directly into his own home repairs, under the guise of community emergency maintenance. Anger bubbled up, but I kept it contained. This wasn't the kind of outrage you shout about. It was the kind you weaponize. I created a spreadsheet, cataloging every suspicious transaction. With each line I filled, Greg's empire of control began to crack. As I highlighted another entry, a pattern caught my eye. One name appearing again and again, like a stain that wouldn't fade. Every check, every reimbursement, every emergency approval. Greg Thornton. And for the first time, I realized he hadn't just stolen my firewood. He'd been stealing from everyone. I nearly dropped the papers. Greg had been stealing from everyone, not just me. The deeper I dug into those ledgers, the more I realized how rotten his little kingdom truly was. It wasn't just 1 or 2 bad transactions buried in fine print. It was a pattern, a blueprint of greed. Line after line showed payments to contractors that didn't exist, repairs that had never happened, and emergency maintenance that somehow always led back to his own house. The total was staggering. Over $30,000 in HOA funds quietly rerouted through accounts that Greg controlled. He'd been reimbursing himself for materials, billing the association for inspections, and even charging the HOA for vehicle use when he drove to check on properties. It was theft dressed up as procedure, hidden behind official-sounding paperwork and rubber-stamped signatures. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the pages. I thought about all the neighbors he'd bullied over tiny fines, families who'd paid hundreds just to avoid conflict, widows who'd handed over checks out of fear. Greg had called it enforcing order, but he'd been funding his own life off their backs. I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my head clear. I couldn't confront him directly, not yet. I needed proof that would survive scrutiny, evidence airtight enough to bring his empire down legally. I started scanning everything, each document, each check number, every timestamp. I saved them to a hidden drive, encrypted and labeled innocuously as household budgets. When I was done, I printed a backup copy and stored it in a sealed envelope behind a loose floorboard in the hallway closet. But I needed someone who understood numbers better than I did, someone who could confirm what I already suspected. That's when I thought of Mark Daniels, my next-door neighbor, a retired accountant who'd once worked in corporate compliance. Mark was quiet, polite, and had kept his distance through most of the HOA chaos, but I knew he watched everything. I knocked on his door just after sunset, manila folder clutched tight in my hands. When he saw my face, his expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Emily, you all right?" I hesitated. I think I found something. Something bad. About Greg. We sat at his kitchen table, and as he went through the documents, his calm professionalism melted into disbelief. Good Lord, he muttered, flipping pages. This isn't mismanagement. This is fraud. He pointed to the ledger entries, explaining how Greg had likely been using HOA accounts to funnel money into personal projects. He's been double booking vendors, Mark said. He cuts a check from HOA funds, deposits it into his own account, and then marks it paid. That's embezzlement. Plain and simple. My stomach twisted. Hearing it confirmed made it real. Can we prove it? I asked. Mark nodded slowly. With what you've got here? Absolutely. But you can't take it to the HOA board. Greg still controls them. You go over his head. He opened his laptop and pulled up the county website. We file a formal complaint with the county auditor's office. Once it's logged, they're required to investigate. If this is as bad as it looks, it'll trigger a full audit. My hands shook as I watched him type the report, uploading copies of every document. The system gave us a confirmation number, one I burned into my memory. When he hit submit, I felt something shift inside me. Fear and adrenaline mixed into something sharper. Quiet power. For the next week, I went about life pretending nothing had changed. Greg still patrolled the neighborhood, still waved that smug little wave when he drove by. But I noticed it now. The nervous twitch in his jaw, the way he avoided eye contact when I was outside. Maybe he sensed the walls closing in, maybe not. Then one morning, I saw it. A thick white envelope sticking out of his mailbox. County seal, bold typeface. Even from across the street, I recognized the words stamped across the top. Notice of audit review. Greg stood in his driveway, reading it, his face turning the color of raw brick. His hand trembled slightly as he lowered the paper, scanning the street. Our eyes met for just a second. He knew. That afternoon, a new notice went out to every mailbox in the neighborhood. It was handwritten, rushed, and reeked of panic. Emergency HOA meeting. Attendance required. Greg wasn't going down quietly. This is a witch hunt, Greg shouted, his voice echoing through the packed town hall. The crowd's murmur swelled, neighbors shifting, whispering, some glaring at him, others looking down, embarrassed. The air was thick with tension, the kind that hums before a storm breaks. Greg stood near the podium, red-faced, fists clenched, trying to project control. But when the county auditor began reading from the ledger, that control began to crack. The meeting had drawn everyone. The HOA board, county officials, even a local reporter with a small camera crew. Rows of folding chairs filled the hall, the smell of coffee and paper hanging heavy in the air. I sat in the second row, hands clasped tightly in my lap. Mark sat beside me, calm as ever, a silent anchor in the chaos. At the front, the county auditor adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. According to financial statements obtained from the Hillside Meadows Homeowners Association, approximately $31,000 were transferred to non-authorized accounts over the past 18 months. All transactions were approved and signed by the same individual, Gregory Thornton, HOA president. A ripple moved through the room. Greg tried to laugh it off. Those were maintenance funds, he said quickly. Emergency repairs, routine operating costs. You're twisting this. But the auditor didn't even look up. The problem, Mr. Thornton, is that these repairs all took place at your personal residence. Gasps filled the hall. Greg's voice cracked. That's not true. I followed procedure. The board approved. One of the board members stood abruptly. We didn't approve a thing, Greg. You forged our signatures. The words hit him like a slap. He took a step back, eyes darting between faces, neighbors he'd fined, friends he'd bullied, people who'd once admired him. Now they stared back like a jury. The auditor kept reading, checks to fake contractors, inflated invoices, falsified votes. Each document appeared on the screen behind her, projected in cold, undeniable black and white. Greg's initials were everywhere. My heart thudded in my chest, not with fear this time, but with the weight of vindication. Every sleepless night, every insult, every fine. This was the moment it all turned. Greg's voice grew desperate. You people don't understand. I've given years to this community. I kept it clean, organized, safe. Without me, it'll fall apart. The sheriff, who'd been leaning against the back wall, stepped forward slowly. Funny, he said evenly. Looks to me like you were keeping it funded, by everyone but yourself. Laughter broke out, low at first, then louder. Greg spun, furious. Quiet. All of you. But his authority was gone. He was a man shouting into a void that no longer feared him. Then the sheriff nodded toward one of his deputies. Mr. Thornton, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and falsifying official documents. Greg's body went rigid. You can't, this isn't. But his words cut off as the metal click of handcuffs echoed through the hall. The sound was sharp, final. The room erupted. Some cheered, others whispered, cameras flashing as Greg was led forward. I sat frozen, tears pricking my eyes. Not out of pity, but out of sheer relief. Justice wasn't always swift, but it had finally found its way here. As the sheriff guided Greg past me, he paused just long enough for our eyes to meet. There was no smirk now, only rage. You think you won, he hissed under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. You have no idea what you've started. Then he was gone, swallowed by the flashing lights outside. For a moment, the hall was quiet except for the shuffle of papers and the murmurs of neighbors realizing how deep the rot had gone. People turned toward me, nodding, whispering thank yous, apologies, disbelief. I didn't respond. My gaze drifted toward the back door, where Linda Thornton, Greg's wife, stood stiffly against the wall, her eyes locked on me. As the meeting broke apart, she brushed past my chair, leaning in just close enough for her breath to hit my ear. This isn't over, she whispered, her voice low and sharp. You'll regret this. And then she was gone, heels striking the floor like gunshots as the doors slammed shut behind her. Greg was gone, but every time a truck passed my driveway my stomach tightened. Even with him in custody, part of me still expected to see that white SUV parked across the street, clipboard glinting in the sun. It's strange how silence can feel heavier than noise. For months, my life had been filled with confrontation, fear, and adrenaline. Now, with the shouting gone, the quiet left room for memory. The HOA disbanded within 2 weeks of Greg's arrest. The board members resigned, one by one, their pride collapsing under the shame of association. The county auditor's office froze the HOA accounts, and a community-wide vote followed. For the first time since I'd moved here, the residents had a say. A new board was elected. Smaller, transparent, run by people who actually cared about fairness instead of power. When the notice came in the mail, Hillside Meadows HOA temporarily dissolved pending restructuring, I laughed until I cried. The irony was too rich. Greg's empire had crumbled under the very paperwork he'd used to control everyone else. In the days that followed, neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me started showing up at my door. Mrs. Callahan from 2 houses down brought a pie and murmured, "We should have spoken up sooner." Another neighbor, David, offered to help clear the fallen branches in my yard, saying, "You were right all along." I smiled, but part of me couldn't forget how easily they'd stayed silent before. Still, forgiveness came easier than I expected. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was knowing that the fight was finally over. The neighborhood began to feel like a community again. People talked, shared tools, even planned a small barbecue to celebrate our freedom. As one resident joked, one evening, I found myself sitting on the same old bench Greg had once mocked, watching the sun dip low behind the trees. The air smelled like cut grass and cedar, a scent that reminded me of my husband, Mark, and the years before all this madness. I finally let myself exhale. The house felt like mine again, not a battleground. I spent the next few weeks rebuilding the firewood shed, repairing the boards that Greg had called sloppy. My hands ached, my back throbbed, but it was worth it. Each nail I hammered in felt like reclaiming something stolen, my peace, my dignity, my home. I treated the wood this time, double-sealed it against pests. Not for Greg. For me. Some nights, though, when the wind rattled the shutters just right, I'd still wake up thinking I heard his voice. Sharp, commanding, too close. It would take a minute before I remembered. Greg Thornton was behind bars facing years of prison time. The fear faded, but the habit of vigilance lingered. During one of the new board's first community meetings, I shared a small piece of advice, my own little legal nugget learned through fire. Always attend your HOA meetings. Silence isn't peace, it's permission. The new members nodded, and for once the room didn't feel like an ambush. It felt like healing. That night, as I came home, the world felt still. The porch light buzzed softly, the crickets chirped, and for the first time in a long time, I thought maybe I could finally rest. But when I stepped onto the porch, I stopped cold. There, sitting in the center of the welcome mat, was a plain white envelope. No stamp, no return address. I bent down slowly, my heart thudding. Inside was a single business card, edges crisp, the name printed in bold black ink, Gregory Thornton. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words, "You ruined me." A knock echoed through my door at dawn. For a second, I thought, it's him. My hand froze mid-air above the coffee mug, heart hammering in my chest. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. It had been weeks since I'd seen Greg, but fear has a way of sticking to your bones. Even after justice, it lingers. When I finally opened the door, it wasn't Greg standing there. It was Deputy Harris, the same officer who'd once questioned me in this very spot. He looked tired but kind, holding a folded document in one hand. "Ms. Carter," he said softly, "you'll want to see this." It was a court notice. Greg had been forced to sell his home. The sale proceeds were to repay the stolen HOA funds and cover restitution to the residents he'd defrauded. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized, his title as HOA president officially revoked. It was over. The headline hit the local news later that morning. Disgraced HOA president loses home after fraud conviction. Neighbors shared the article around the block. Some gloated, others just looked relieved. Greg's once impressive cedar deck, his pride and joy, was photographed in the piece, now half demolished, eaten through by termites and weather. The caption read, "Property damage consistent with neglect." I almost laughed. Karma had a sense of humor. I stepped outside, breathing in the morning air. The chill carried a sweetness to it now. The frost on the lawn glistened like a clean slate. For the first time in months, my body didn't feel tight with tension. The constant dread that something, or someone, was watching had faded with the dawn. Over the next few weeks, I focused on rebuilding. The shed came first, stronger this time, reinforced with pressure-treated lumber. Every board was sealed, every nail driven in straight. I even replaced the gate Greg had climbed over, fitting it with a steel lock and a new sign that read simply, "Private Property." I cleaned up the garden, repainted the porch, and restacked the firewood neatly along the wall. The sound of splitting logs felt therapeutic, the axe thudding rhythmically, each strike cutting away what was left of that chapter. Sometimes, as I worked, neighbors would stop by to check in. There was laughter now, soft, hesitant, but real. The community Greg had ruled through fear was beginning to remember what trust felt like. One evening, sitting on the steps of the rebuilt shed, I thought back to everything that had happened. The fines, the lies, the accusations, the silence that had followed his downfall. And somewhere in that reflection, I realized something that surprised me. Revenge had never been the goal. Justice didn't need it. Truth, patience, and a little courage had been enough. Greg's greed had consumed him long before the termites did. I brushed sawdust from my hands, watching the sun dip below the tree line, and for once I felt still, whole. The air smelled like pine and fresh paint, not fear. Later that night, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth crawl up my hands. The flames cracked softly, the kind of sound that fills silence instead of breaking it. As the embers glowed, I whispered to the empty room, "We're safe now, Mark." And I believed it. But just as I set another log onto the fire, a moving truck rumbled up the road. The sound grew louder, closer. Headlights swept across my windows, casting long shadows across the walls. Curious, I stepped onto the porch. A large white van pulled into the driveway next door. The logo on the side read Hillside Meadows Property Management Association. A man in a suit climbed out, clipboard in hand, assessing the property. I felt my breath catch. Across the yard, he looked up and gave me a polite smile. "Morning, ma'am," he called. "Name's Richard Collins. I'm the new HOA president for the neighborhood transition." The coffee mug slipped slightly in my hand. "Of course you are," I murmured. "What would you have done in my place? Would you have fought back? Or let it go? Share your story below.